Chinese monks showed the shocking secret behind Mount Kailash. It's shocking. In the summer of 2001, a team of elite mountaineers from Spain quietly obtained something that had never been granted before in modern history: permission from the Chinese government to attempt the first confirmed ascent of Mount Kailash. These were not amateurs. These were experienced climbers with resumes built on some of the most dangerous peaks on the planet. The permit was real. The funding was real. The plan was real. And then, within weeks, it collapsed. Not because of an avalanche, not because of a storm, not because of altitude sickness or equipment failure. It collapsed because the moment word of the expedition reached the outside world, a wave of protest rose up so fast and so fierce that the Chinese authorities reversed course and pulled the permit entirely. Buddhist leaders, Hindu organizations, Jain communities, and Bon practitioners from 4 different corners of Asia, groups that rarely agree on anything, united within days to stop a single expedition from setting foot on a single mountain. Why would a rock formation in a remote corner of western Tibet generate that kind of unified global reaction? Why has no human being, in all of recorded history, ever confirmed reaching the summit of Mount Kailash, even though far taller and far more dangerous peaks nearby have been climbed dozens of times? And why, according to monks who have lived in the monasteries surrounding this mountain for generations, has silence about what they know finally started to break? Stay with me, because the story of Kailash is not simply a story about religion. It is a story about geography that should not make sense, geometry that should not exist in nature, and a mountain that the modern world still cannot fully explain. To understand why that 2001 permit mattered so much, you have to understand just how unusual it is for the Chinese government to authorize any expedition to this particular mountain at all. Access to the Nari region has historically been tightly controlled, both because of its remoteness and because of its proximity to sensitive border areas. And travel permits for foreigners wishing to even visit the base of Kailash for pilgrimage or trekking purposes have often been difficult to secure. A permit specifically authorizing a summit attempt was, by most accounts, unprecedented, and once it became public, the reaction was immediate. Newspapers across India and Nepal ran stories condemning the plan. Religious leaders issued public statements. Diplomatic pressure reportedly built quickly on Beijing to reconsider. Within a matter of weeks, the permit was withdrawn, and the Spanish team, to their credit, respected the decision and did not attempt to proceed without authorization. It remains to this day the closest any modern expedition has come to legally attempting the summit of Kailash, and it never got past a written permit before being reversed. Mount Kailash rises 6,738 meters above sea level in the Ngari region of western Tibet, and one of the most remote and difficult to reach places on Earth. In terms of raw height, it is not especially remarkable. Everest stands nearly 2.5 kilometers taller. K2 is more dangerous by almost any measure climbers use. Dozens of peaks across the Himalayan and Karakoram ranges are higher, harder, and colder, and human beings have stood on top of every one of them. Kailash is the exception. Despite decades of interest from climbers around the world, despite the Spanish attempt in 2001 and quiet inquiries from other expeditions before and after it, no confirmed summit of Kailash exists in the historical record. Chinese authorities have restricted climbing permits for the mountain for years, largely in response to the religious significance of the peak, and most serious mountaineers have voluntarily stayed away out of respect. The Italian climber, Reinhold Messner, one of the most accomplished alpinists in history, was reportedly offered the opportunity to attempt Kailash in the 1980s and turned it down, saying that if climbers conquered this particular mountain, they would be conquering something inside the people who consider it sacred. Whether or not that story is told with perfect accuracy today, the underlying fact remains. The mountain sits unclimbed in an era when human beings have stood on top of nearly every difficult peak on the planet, including several in the immediate vicinity of Kailash that involve far more technical climbing and far greater objective danger from rockfall, crevasses, and unpredictable weather. The reason so many people leave Kailash alone has almost nothing to do with technical difficulty, and everything to do with what the mountain represents. Tibetan Buddhists call it Kang Rinpoche, the precious snow mountain, and believe it to be the earthly home of the deity Demchok, a manifestation associated with supreme bliss and enlightenment. In Hinduism, Kailash is regarded as the eternal abode of Lord Shiva, one of the principal deities of the faith, the god associated with both destruction and transformation. Ancient Hindu texts describe the mountain as a kind of cosmic axis, a fixed point around which the structure of the universe is organized. In Jainism, the mountain is known as Mount Ashtapada, traditionally associated with the site where Rishabhanatha, the first of the 24 Tirthankaras, is said to have attained spiritual liberation. And in Bon, the indigenous religion of Tibet that predates Buddhism in the region by centuries, Kailash is considered the spiritual center of the world, the source point from which the religion's power and cosmology originate. 4 entirely separate belief systems, developed independently across different centuries, in different languages, across different cultures, spanning thousands of kilometers, all arrived at the exact same conclusion about the exact same mountain. That kind of convergence, four unrelated civilizations pointing at one peak and calling it the most sacred place on Earth, is the first detail about Kailash that resists easy explanation. It helps to understand how differently these traditions typically diverge on almost everything else. Hinduism and Jainism share some historical roots on the Indian subcontinent, but developed radically different theological systems over the centuries. Buddhism emerged from within that same broad region, but eventually spread outward and transformed into countless distinct schools across Asia, many of which disagree sharply with one another on doctrine and practice. Bon, meanwhile, developed independently in Tibet, shaped by shamanic and animist traditions that predate any of the other three religions in that specific geography. These are not four branches of a single tree. They are four largely separate roots that happen to grow toward the same mountain. Scholars who study comparative religion have long pointed to Kailash as one of the rare verifiable examples of what researchers sometimes call independent sacred convergence, a real documented phenomenon. In religious geography, where unrelated cultures identify the same physical location as spiritually significant without ever having contact with one another to influence that choice, a pattern seen at only a handful of sites anywhere on the planet. For thousands of years, pilgrims from all four traditions have performed what is known as the Kora, a ritual circumambulation of the mountain along a roughly 52-kilometer path that circles its base without ever ascending the peak itself. Devout Hindus and Buddhists typically complete the walk in 3 days, camping along the route at high altitude and brutal cold. Some of the most devoted practitioners, particularly certain Tibetan Buddhists, attempt the entire circuit through a series of full body prostrations, lying flat on the ground, marking the spot their fingertips reach, standing and repeating the motion for the full distance, a practice that can take these pilgrims close to a month to complete. Millions of people have made this pilgrimage over the centuries, and across every one of those traditions, the belief is consistent. Walking around Kailash, or rather than climbing it, is what produces spiritual transformation. The mountain, in other words, is not meant to be conquered. It is meant to be witnessed, circled, and respected from a fixed distance, a rule that every major tradition associated with the peak has followed without exception for as long as records exist. The physical difficulty of the Kora should not be underestimated. Pilgrims walk at altitudes that regularly exceed 5,000 meters, crossing the Dolmala Pass, the highest point on the route, at over 5,600 meters above sea level, in conditions where oxygen levels are roughly half of what they are at sea level. Many pilgrims arrive from lowland regions of India and Nepal with little time to acclimatize, and altitude sickness along the route is common. Despite this, the tradition holds that a single completion of the Kora is believed by many Hindus and Buddhists to cleanse the sins of one lifetime, and that completing the circuit 108 times, a sacred number across several Asian religious traditions, is believed by some practitioners to guarantee enlightenment. Whether or not one accepts that belief, the sheer physical and logistical commitment involved illustrates just how central this ritual has remained to the religious identity of hundreds of millions of people across multiple faiths. For a mountain, most of them will never set foot on. What makes Kailash even stranger, and what has made it a subject of fascination well beyond religious circles, is its physical shape. Most mountains form through millions of years of tectonic pressure, erosion, and glacial carving, and the result is almost always visually chaotic. Ridgelines are jagged, faces are uneven. Nothing about a typical mountain looks planned. Kailash does not follow that pattern. Its four faces are often described by geologists, mountaineers, and visitors alike as strikingly regular, with slopes that appear close to symmetrical when viewed from a distance, and a rough alignment toward the four cardinal directions that has struck observers for centuries as unusual for a purely natural formation. Scientists who study the region attribute this to the specific composition of the rock, layers of conglomerate stone that erode and fracture in more uniform patterns than the granite and sedimentary layers found in most of the surrounding Himalayan range. That is very likely the correct geological explanation. But it does not fully erase the visual impression that has driven religious and cultural fascination with this mountain for millennia. The sense, shared across cultures that had no contact with one another, that Kailash simply does not look like something that grew out of the earth by accident. Photographs of the mountain taken from the north, the traditional viewpoint most visible from the Kora route, consistently show a strikingly triangular, almost stepped profile, sometimes described as resembling a natural pyramid capped in snow and ice year-round, a shape that has led some visitors over the centuries to describe it less as a mountain and more as a monument. The monasteries surrounding Kailash, including sites like Chugompa, perched above the nearby Lake Manasarovar, and Gangdrak Monastery closer to the mountain itself, have maintained oral and written traditions about the peak for generations. Monks in this region have historically lived in relative isolation, some observing long periods of silence as part of their spiritual practice. And the knowledge passed down within these communities blends religious teaching with observations about the mountain, its weather patterns, its effect on travelers, and the dangers of the terrain surrounding it. In recent years, as tourism and pilgrimage traffic to the region has increased and outside interest in Kailash has grown, some of these communities have become more willing to discuss aspects of their tradition that were previously shared only within the monastery walls. It is important to be clear about what this means. These accounts are oral tradition and religious teaching, not scientific documentation, and they should be understood in that context. But the content of what has been shared is still worth examining, because it reveals just how deeply layered the mystery of this mountain runs, even once you strip away exaggeration. Life inside these monasteries has changed relatively little over the centuries compared to most of the modern world. Many of the monks who maintain these traditions spend years, sometimes decades, in structured meditation retreats, some involving extended periods of silence, before they are considered ready to receive and eventually pass on the deeper layers of teaching associated with the mountain. This is not unique to Kailash. Similar structures of graduated spiritual instruction exist across Tibetan Buddhism and Bon more broadly. What makes the Kailash monasteries distinct is the specific body of knowledge tied directly to the mountain itself. Observations about weather patterns, safe and unsafe routes, the psychological state of pilgrims at different points along the Kora, and teachings about the symbolic meaning of the peak that have been refined and passed down across an unusually long and unbroken lineage, given how isolated and difficult to reach this region has remained for most of its history. According to teachings maintained within several of these monastic communities, Kailash is described using language that translates roughly to an anchor point, a place where ordinary experience becomes unreliable the closer a person gets to the peak. Pilgrims for generations have reported a range of physical sensations near the mountain that go beyond what altitude alone would explain, a heavy sense of exhaustion that some describe as different from typical high-altitude fatigue, and a psychological pull, an internal instinct urging them to stop and turn back before reaching certain points on the Kora route. Whether this is a spiritual phenomenon, a psychological response to the overwhelming scale and religious weight of the location, or the physical toll of extreme altitude combined with thin air and cold, is genuinely open to interpretation, and different observers will draw different conclusions. What is consistent across centuries of pilgrim accounts from people with no connection to one another is the description itself. Something about proximity to Kailash produces an effect that pilgrims across radically different eras and backgrounds describe in strikingly similar terms. Modern travelers to the region, including researchers, documentary crews, and mountaineers who have approached the base of the mountain in the past several decades, have added to this body of anecdotal reports. Some visitors describe compass behavior that seems inconsistent near the mountain, and this claim, unlike some of the more elaborate stories that circulate online, has at least a plausible scientific basis. The Kailash region does sit within a geologically unusual zone, and localized magnetic anomalies caused by specific mineral deposits and rock composition are a documented phenomenon in mountain ranges around the world, capable of producing genuine compass deviation in certain areas. Whether the anomalies reported specifically at Kailash have been rigorously measured and published in peer-reviewed studies is a separate question, and much of what circulates about equipment failure near the mountain remains anecdotal rather than confirmed by controlled data. It is a case where the underlying science, localized magnetic anomalies affecting compasses, is real and well understood in general, even if the specific claims about Kailash deserve more caution than the more sensational corners of the internet tend to give them. Similar caution applies to reports of drone and camera malfunctions near the peak, which are far more likely explained by extreme cold, thin air affecting battery performance, and the sheer remoteness of the region, making equipment recovery difficult, than by anything mysterious emanating from the mountain itself. The geography surrounding Kailash is where the story moves from folklore into something that is simply verifiably true and arguably more remarkable than any legend attached to the mountain. 4 of Asia's most important rivers originate from the immediate vicinity of Kailash, within a relatively small radius of high-altitude terrain. The Indus River, one of the great rivers of South Asia, begins near the northern side of the region and flows through Tibet, India, and Pakistan before reaching the Arabian Sea. The Sutlej River, a major tributary of the Indus system, originates near Lake Rakshastal, close to Kailash, and flows through northern India. The Brahmaputra, known in Tibet as the Yarlung Changpo, one of the largest rivers on Earth by water volume, begins its journey in the same general region before making its long curve through Tibet, India, and Bangladesh. And the Karnali River, a major tributary that eventually feeds into the Ganges system, also traces its origin back to this same remote stretch of the Tibetan plateau. 4 enormous river systems, each one critical to the water supply of hundreds of millions of people across South Asia, all beginning within a relatively short distance of the same mountain, flowing outward in 4 different directions that roughly mirror the 4 faces of Kailash itself. To put the scale of this in perspective, the Indus alone supports one of the largest irrigation systems on the planet, sustaining agriculture across Pakistan and northern India for millions of farmers. The Brahmaputra, by average discharge, ranks among the largest rivers in the world, and its basin supports one of the most densely populated river deltas on Earth once it merges with the Ganges in Bangladesh. The Sutlej feeds major hydroelectric projects and irrigation canals across Punjab. The Karnali, meanwhile, remains one of the last major undammed rivers in Nepal, still running largely free from its glacial origins near Kailash all the way to its confluence with the Ganges basin. Combined, hydrologists estimate that these 4 river systems support the fresh water needs of close to 2 billion people when downstream populations across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal are accounted for together. Very few single geographic points on the entire planet can claim to sit at the headwaters of that much of humanity's fresh water supply simultaneously, and the fact that this exact point also happens to be considered the most sacred mountain by 4 major world religions is, at minimum, a genuinely remarkable coincidence of geography and belief. This is not legend or interpretation. It is basic hydrology, confirmed by modern mapping and satellite data, and it is genuinely one of the most striking geographic facts connected to any single peak on the planet. Ancient Hindu cosmology describes a mythical mountain called Mount Meru, positioned at the center of the universe as the source of 4 sacred rivers flowing in 4 directions. The descriptions from religious texts written long before satellite mapping existed align this closely with the real measurable geography of Kailash is one of the genuinely startling coincidences in the study of ancient sacred geography, whether or not one attributes it to religious insight, careful ancient observation, or coincidence. Some modern writers and researchers, working outside mainstream archaeology and geology, have gone further and proposed that Kailash sits along a series of geometric alignments connecting it to other ancient sacred sites around the world, including the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, Stonehenge in England, the Stoneheads of Easter Island, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the ruins of Petra in Jordan. This idea, often referred to as sacred geometry or ley line theory, is popular in certain corners of alternative history and remains a genuinely fascinating idea to explore. But it is important to be direct about where it stands scientifically. Mainstream archaeologists and geographers do not accept these global alignment claims as demonstrated fact, and the mathematics involved in connecting any set of sufficiently large and unevenly distributed points on a sphere the size of Earth can produce apparent alignments that are more a function of geometry and chance than evidence of ancient global coordination. That does not mean the idea isn't worth thinking about, only that it belongs firmly in the category of intriguing speculation rather than established science, and any honest account of Kailash needs to draw that line clearly. What can be said with much more confidence is that the religious status of Kailash has had a real and measurable effect on the modern world, well beyond the failed 2001 climbing attempt. The Chinese government, aware of the mountain's significance to an enormous population across multiple countries, has generally avoided authorizing climbing expeditions in the decades since, and international mountaineering federations have largely treated Kailash as an unofficial no-climb zone out of respect for the religious communities who consider it their most sacred site. This is a rare case in the history of modern mountaineering, an era defined by the relentless pursuit of every unclimbed peak on Earth, where a genuinely climbable mountain, technically within reach of skilled teams with modern equipment, remains untouched, not because nature has defeated every attempt, but because the world made a collective decision, largely unspoken and informal, to leave it alone. The monastic communities living in the shadow of Kailash describe this restraint using their own language and their own framework, one that predates modern conservation or cultural sensitivity movements by many centuries. In their teachings, the mountain is not simply a religious symbol to be protected out of courtesy. It is treated as an active presence, something that continues to shape the behavior of everyone who approaches it, pilgrim and outsider alike, through a combination of natural terrain, extreme altitude, remoteness, and a psychological weight built from thousands of years of unbroken devotion. Whether you interpret the pull that climbers, pilgrims, and researchers describe as a genuinely mysterious force, a deeply internalized cultural reverence, or simply the natural intimidation produced by one of the most physically demanding and remote environments on the planet, the practical result has been the same for centuries. Kailash remains untouched at its summit, circled endlessly at its base, and studied constantly from a respectful distance. There is a reason this mountain continues to draw attention from geologists, religious scholars, mountaineers, and increasingly from documentary makers and researchers interested in ancient sacred sites. It sits at the intersection of several genuinely rare qualities that almost never overlap on a single landform anywhere else on Earth. A peak considered supremely sacred by 4 major world religious traditions simultaneously, A geological formation with an unusually regular symmetrical shape that has fascinated observers for centuries. A source point for 4 of the largest river systems on the continent, feeding water to a population measured in the hundreds of millions. A modern history in which one of the only realistic opportunities to climb the mountain collapsed almost overnight under the pressure of global religious solidarity. And a body of monastic oral tradition, only recently becoming more visible to the outside world, that treats the mountain not as a passive backdrop to religious belief, but as something that continues to actively shape the behavior of everyone who comes near it. None of these facts, taken individually, proves anything supernatural is happening at Kailash. The symmetry can likely be explained by rock composition and erosion patterns. The magnetic anomalies, where genuinely documented, fit within known geological science. The exhaustion and psychological pull reported by pilgrims can be reasonably explained by extreme altitude, cold, and the emotional intensity of completing a pilgrimage that carries this much spiritual weight for the people undertaking it. And the failed 2001 expedition has a clear, well-documented explanation rooted in religious protest and international diplomacy, rather than anything mysterious happening on the mountain itself. But taken together, a mountain this geographically important, this religiously significant across 4 unrelated traditions, this visually unusual, and this consistently left alone across the entire modern era of mountaineering, represents something genuinely rare. Not necessarily proof of the supernatural, but proof that some places on this planet still carry enough weight, enough history, and enough unanswered questions to resist being fully explained, mapped, and conquered, even in an age when almost nothing else on Earth remains unclimbed, unmapped, or unexplored by satellite, drone, or expedition. The monks who live in the monasteries surrounding Kailash are not claiming to have unlocked some hidden scientific secret buried inside the mountain. What they are offering, increasingly openly in recent years, is centuries of accumulated observation, tradition, and lived experience from communities that have watched pilgrims arrive, struggle, transform, and leave change for longer than most modern religions have existed. That accumulated knowledge, even stripped of exaggeration and myth, paints a picture of a mountain that has earned its reputation honestly through geography, history, and the sheer weight of belief that 4 separate civilizations have placed on the same remote peak for thousands of years. Whether Kailash ever reveals anything more specific than that is a question that, for now, remains entirely open. And the monks themselves would likely tell you that some questions are better left unanswered until the world is ready to understand them properly. A patience that, after thousands of years, this mountain has clearly never lost. If this video made you look at Mount Kailash differently, subscribe to the channel. Every week, we explore the places, the discoveries, and the questions that sit right at the edge of what science and history can fully explain. The next one may change the way you see the world all over again,